Hey everybody, welcome to a new edition of Inwarp Mag. I'm Drew, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Brooke. And this week we are going to talk about why we decided to start playing Warhammer in 10th edition. So we want to talk about what about the rules of 10th edition attracted us to the game so much to start playing now. And if you're new to this channel, in our last episode, we explained how we're new players. We've never played Warhammer before, and we're going to be playing our first game of Warhammer probably in a week from now, hopefully in a week from now. And we just thought it would make sense at this point to explain what attracted us to the game. And we don't mean for this episode to be like controversial at all. If you've been playing the game for years, we're not attacking old players of the game. If you liked previous editions, we don't really have anything against previous editions. We're just talking about from the perspective of 10th edition only, what attracted us to the game. So Brooke, do you want to go ahead and get us started with the first thing that we want to talk about today?
Yeah. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is kind of it was a new thing for 10th edition, and that is the free and accessible rules. And I know the indexes aren't necessarily a new thing, but they kind of went back to indexes. But the fact that rules are free from a general core rules aspect, and then we get these rules on a nice website that has nice download links, and we can readily go get them and read them, and we have our indexes for every faction, so every faction can play the game. It's a really nice part of wanting, if I'm interested in the game, I can go and check out the game for free, and it's all readily available to me. um it's actually really nice compared to games that we've played previously, such as Kill Team. One of the things that we didn't like about Kill Team, at least from my perspective, is the core rules you had to buy, which sure, you have to buy core rules, but they came out with the compendium, which is effectively what the indexes are for 10th edition. And as opposed to the indexes, which are free, the compendium you had to buy. And that was the day one. Need to buy the core rules to learn how to play the game, and I need to buy the compendium to know how to build my lists. And those were both intro costs just to play the game. But in 40k, in 10th edition, I can look at how to play, and I can go and find my index and figure out how to build my army and my army specific rules and get ready to play without having to make this upfront investment to have access to the rules and be able to play the game. It's super nice.
Yeah, and I think this will probably segue nicely into our next topic, but I think probably one of the biggest complaints when 10th edition first released was, even though we had free indexes, when we got the free indexes or indices, whatever the plural would be, um, that,
Indeci.
yeah, sure. The people were very upset with the balancing issues, and I can definitely understand that as a player coming from another war game, that it isn't fun when your army just is going to lose, straight up lose to another army. And when Warhammer 10th edition first came out, um, Eldari was just dominating everything. They had like a 70% win rate, and that doesn't even take into account when it was Eldari on Eldari crime, that if an Eldari beat an Eldari, then one lost and one won. But if you take that out of the picture, it's like above 80%, which is just insane. Like, that would not
Yeah.
have been fun. So I think, segueing into our next topic, we really like the balance in Warhammer 40k as opposed to other games. We come from Star Wars Legion, which we explained in our previous episode if you haven't listened to it. And like, the balance in 40k is nowhere near close in a good way for 40k to Star Wars Legion. It's just nice that since I've been following the game, there's been two Dataslates that have come out to address some of these balancing issues, and the game is in such a good state right now as far as balance goes.
Right. And with a game like Legion, you only have effectively five factions. There are these things called battle forces that are themed lists within the faction. Like there's a Hoth list, and there's an Endor Empire list, and there's an Ewok list. But those are kind of sub faction lists. But within the five core factions that exist in Legion, the disparity between the lowest and the highest is about the same or worse than what the current 40k balance is. So, I, like for example, when it was at its worst, when we were playing Legion, the worst armies were at about 40 to 43, 44% win rate, and the highest lists would get upwards of like 60% win rate. And that's with five factions. So if you chose one faction and you choose that lowest faction, you're gonna be at the worst version of the 40k faction that's doing the worst right now. Like you have locked into that faction that's doing the worst. And the thing that makes Legion less appealing, and one of the things that makes 40k so appealing to us, is that these balanced data slates come out pretty regularly, as opposed to Legion comes out maybe once a year. So if you're stuck with a faction that has a 43% win rate or whatever, you are not stuck with it for more than a quarter or two if they don't fix it right away. If they don't get it enough, if they don't give you enough on the low end to give you that boost that you want. But in Legion, you're stuck with it for a year, and it makes the game far less appealing. We're going to Adepticon in a week, and one of the things that we're going to do, and we did this last year, is watch the World Championships for Star Wars Legion, and it's super fun. And last year was awesome. It was so much fun to watch. But the appeal is lessened a little bit this year because the meta hasn't changed much, because they've not balanced the factions. I don't think they've released a balance update for about a year. And
Just
that
new battle forces or whatever. That's the only meta change, really.
right. And that is far less appealing to us, and seeing the game change so often with 40k is such a big positive to us. And I know some people don't like how quickly it changes, but as somebody, and Drew, you have the experience of this with clones, but as somebody who had played a faction that was on the low end of Legion and having it not change for so long, 40k is super appealing.
Yeah, definitely. It's just I don't feel like if I lock it's such a commitment to buy into a faction in any war game, and not to feel like as a naive player that I made the wrong decision. Two years down the line, it's like, holy crap, I wish I could have talked to myself 2 years ago to say, like, don't buy Republic. You're going to be miserable when you're building a list because you can't afford anything to build a standard list. So it's just like the fact that you're not going to be locked into the sins of your faction's past is just like, that to me is just makes the game so much better compared to other war
and the
games.
and the sins of the people who don't balance the game frequently. It's like you get sucked into a faction who has just been nerfed, like you did with clones, and you have to pay the price for a year because they don't update the rules for so long, and you're stuck with a faction that goes on to have a 40 some about a 40% win rate in tournaments from that point on,
Yep.
until they finally updated it,
It's
and you're there
definitely,
stuck.
yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword. You can kind of be screwed by how other players abuse the faction in the past. Then you can also be screwed by the fact that the company who regular updates your game just doesn't seem to care about your game maybe as much as other ones that they have. So it's just the fact that there's a lot of hate on GW, but the balance in the game currently where you have what, like 29 factions, versus Star Wars Legion essentially has 5 factions, and that disparity hurts so much worse than Star Wars Legion, that the fact that they can't balance 5 factions, but somehow GW can balance out 29 factions to where the meta and the faction balance right now is pretty stinking healthy. That's just amazing to me that they have the people who are capable of doing that. That's awesome to me.
It's an impossible task for sure. And the fact that they've acknowledged that they want to balance the game is really nice. And for our experience with Legion, they the company that runs Legion, they acknowledged that they didn't necessarily care about balance. So as people who wanted to play a fair game, it kind of hinders our enjoyment of the game if we know that the game is not very balanced. Um, and speaking of balance, one of the nice things about 40k is that when I choose my faction and I know that it's going to be balanced in a relatively good short amount of time, it's nice that when I choose my faction, I'm not locked into a certain way to play that faction. For example, me with my Space Wolves, I chose them as my first faction, and I chose them when I didn't really know a ton about the game, at least how it played, at least the rules wise. But as a Space Marines player, as to maybe the chagrin of many people who are not Space Marines players, I have a ton of options, and I have tons of archetypes that I can choose from. And I know Space Wolves are really good at melee, but if I wanted to make a shooty list, there's nothing that stops me from doing that.
Well, we'll say same with orcs. So one of the issues when I first bought my units to build my orc army is I was kind of crippled as far as continuing forward as far as painting my army, because I wasn't sure what color I wanted to paint them, because I knew in previous editions kind of your paint scheme dictated a lot about what kind of army archetype you were going to have. So I I always liked the paint scheme of the Evil Sons, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to play the Speedwa or not, because it was, a lot of people said it was not great in ninth edition. And I think it was what, Goff or whatever was kind of considered the best orc faction or whatever, but they just didn't, like, that paint scheme didn't appeal to me. And then as soon as I found out that, your paint scheme is not tied to the rules that you want to play with, I just went crazy. I'm like, all right, I'm painting my army red now. So that is cool, because I don't think you should have the hobbying aspect of the game tied so closely to the rules of the game, because it frees the players to make more creative decisions with their army, and it just makes it more fun for everyone, and less competitive focused for people who just want to build like a cool looking army. Like me, that's one of my favorite things to do. I love to see my army on the board, and once they're all on the board, I'm like, these look sweet. That appeals to me, but I don't want my army to just get shot off the board because I'm stuck into playing a bad faction.
Yeah, and one of the things is analysis paralysis, and that is also from the hobby side. If you are looking to get into a war game and you are trying to just hobby it to have fun, but then you look at the rules and you're like, oh, if I want to play the rules that I like, I have to paint them this way. And maybe that way that you have to paint them isn't the way that you want to paint them. Now that those are kind of broken, is really nice. As a Space Marines player, I paint my guys as Space Wolves, but I can go play a variety of detachments within the Space Marines faction, and that is really nice for me, because if I don't like the Champions of Rust detachment, which is not very good right now, I can go choose to run a different detachment that is not locked into my paint scheme, as opposed to maybe in 9th edition Space Marines, their codex would have this these specific set of rules were locked to the Imperial Fists, or these ones were locked to the Salamanders. And now that they've broken that, it's nice that I can run the faction, run the type of rules that I want, that uh, accommodates the units that I want to run, and not be punished because of some hobby choice I made.
Mm-hmm. All right. So let's go ahead and move into our next point. So this one isn't necessarily new to 10th edition. It's always been, as far as I know, in Warhammer 40k. But to us, this is something new. So I guess, we could have come to other editions too because of this. But just kind of the way that Warhammer treats Horde armies versus elite armies. So, like, take your orcs versus your custodies. That's just like the way that it's done. If you haven't really played other war games, you might not realize how well it's done in Warhammer 40k versus other games. So when I talk about this, I think the main factor that dictates the way that a Horde army versus elite army plays is really kind of done in the activation order. So in Warhammer 40k, it's a you go then I go style game. But in other games, which people have talked about Warhammer maybe going into this, but I think it's a mistake. But the alternating activation, which is how Star Wars Legion is, it doesn't work as well for a Horde army. And do you want to go ahead and explain that a little bit, Brooke?
Yeah, I think the you go I go thematically benefits the Horde versus Elite so much better. And to elaborate on the Legion example, there's the faction of the CIS and Separatists, and they have tons of droids. And if you ever watch Clone Wars, and they're supposed to be this overwhelming force that they just have sheer numbers, and they just push up the board as this, lines of droids. But in practice, it doesn't really act like that. It's per unit you get 2 extra models, and you can't give them too many activations, because in a game like Star Wars Legion, activations matter tremendously when it comes to objective play. But in a game like 40k, while having more units is good so that you can run different objectives, it's not the thing that makes or breaks a list. If Drew is running a list of orcs and he has 12 activations, and I'm running Space Wolves and I have 7, we are still going to be able to play the game and have a balanced game. Whereas if I was playing Legion and I have a list that has 11 activations and Drew has one that has 8, those are not balanced, most likely, unless you have like a very specific build. But most likely those are not balanced, and that's not a huge disparity in the number of lists, in the number of activations in a list. But that 1 to 2 extra activations adds up when it's a I go with 1 unit and then you go with 1 unit, and then at the end of your turn, when you're done activating all of your units and I have 3 more, I get to activate with 3 of my units and do stuff without any repercussions based on what you're going to do on your turn, because you can't react to my 3 effectively free activations.
Yeah, I guess just imagine a game where everybody plays like custodies. Like, as soon as you lose a few units, you get super cagey and just try to peel off units from the enemy rather than, just playing your game and having fun. So
Yeah, I
that's
think that's actually a super good point, because like in a game like Legion where every activation matters, in a game like 40k where it's you go I go, and you play a horde army, if you lose a unit, like if Drew, if you're playing orcs and you lose a unit of boys, you're probably not that hurt, because you're just like, oh, it's just a boys unit. I have 3 more in my list, and you can still shove your entire list in my face and it's still going to be just as effective. Maybe not just, I mean, it'll have, obviously you're missing a unit of boys, but you're still going to be able to do what your list wants to do, as opposed to if you lose a key unit. If you lose a unit in Legion, it is a huge detriment to just running objectives, and it can make or break the entire game.
and one last thing I think I want to highlight is just that the way in a uh, alternating activation game is balanced, it's typically just by making the units really, really weak. So with CIS, with the B1s, the basic droids that are from the Phantom Menace, they suck. They're just really bad. They're maybe good for running an objective, but like it doesn't take long for you to lose. Like if you don't even necessarily need to target them in Star Wars Legion because they're so bad. You're just like, whatever, you can do your thing. You're probably not going to do that much to me. But that's how it's balanced. They make their Horde like battle line units garbage, but like with orcs, Brooke was saying, like if I have a unit of boys, I can still do work. If I had a unit of 10 boys hop out of a truck with like a war boss attached to it, Brooke with his space wolves is going to be pretty fearful of that untouched unit of boys. It's not something that can just be ignored. He may have peeled off my other unit of boys, but I still have another one in his face, and I could just completely wipe out that unit because it's just that's kind of how an overwhelming force would play. Like, I took out this entire unit of boys, but there's another one. It's the green tide. I'm being washed over by this green tide of orcs. It's just so much more thematic to the game, and it just gives you so many more interesting strategic choices in how you want to play the game instead of just you pay attention to the activation count of you versus your opponent. If I'm down an act, I need to start playing cagey. It's just like it becomes very predictable on how people are going to play the game, and it's a lot less fun.
Yeah, I think we can't really discount the theme of a green tide versus a small band of Space Marines on the table. It's a very cool thing to be able to do, where you read about this in books or you see it in somebody's lore YouTube video where they're talking about some event that happened, and you get to kind of reenact that in a way where you have a quote unquote lore accurate battle going on. It's a ton of fun. I think that is something that we can't really discount is how the Horde versus Elite accommodates the lore aspect of every faction.
Mm-hmm.
But while we do like a lot of stuff, this isn't a video meant to be all about what we love about 10th edition. There are a few things that we don't like about 10th edition, and we're going to talk about one of those today. And the main thing that we don't like that much about 10th edition is the terrain rules, and specifically with ruins. But there are other terrain rules in general that, like, terrain rules in general to us are very complicated, and it's kind of exemplified in ruins. And I think Drew has some examples of what we're talking about.
Yeah, so I know from previous editions of Warhammer, just from following the game, that the rules to previous players are way more simplified, and that's a good thing. But we come from Star Wars Legion, where basically you sit down with your opponent when you get to a table, and together you define your terrain as being light cover or heavy cover, and that's pretty much all you need to know about all of your terrain to play a game of Star Wars Legion. Versus, in Warhammer, you have all the different types of terrain, like ruins and barricades and whatnot. Don't know. I don't have them all memorized. Yeah,
whatever.
Debris. There's just too many types of terrain, and it just makes things a lot more complicated than I think they should be. And it also runs into these really weird rule situations, which we'll highlight shortly. But this picture here is just, it probably looks very normal to a Warhammer 40k player, but one thing that bothers me is just all these templates that are below the ruins terrain, which is something that I've never done before in another war game, that you have to have a template to define this is the base of the ruin, and if you're inside of it, you are wholly within it. If you're outside of it, then you are not. Or if you're partially within it, that's just silly, and it leads to really weird rules things, and this is from a Goonhammer article where they break down like line of sight in ruins, and they have some really good illustrations in here, which is what this is from. Um, but yeah,
Yep.
so go ahead, Brooke.
It, the thing I just want to highlight, I guess, is these rules aren't very intuitive, as opposed to some of the games that we're used to are fairly intuitive. And Legion got a cover update that it made it a little less intuitive, and we didn't really like that, but it's still a lot more intuitive than what this is. The templates, if I have my guy on the template, then he gets this set of rules. And if he's like, oh, if half the unit's not in the template, then they have these rules. And if they're in this part of the ruin, then we think about the window versus the wall and whatever. Like there's all this complication in a piece of terrain on top of an already complicated system of rules in 10th edition that just make playing the game have a lot more overhead than I think is necessary to enjoy a game. And maybe it's for the competitive scene. Maybe it's to make it as fair as possible while giving variation to terrain so it's not all the same. But the overhead as new players, especially the overhead of learning terrain rules just to play your first game and just try to comprehend all these different terrain types is overwhelming, as opposed to a game like Legion. And if you go to a convention like Adepticon or Gen Con, and you go and you see the Legion tables, you'll see awesome tables. And you'll see, oh, that's the Naboo table, and that's the Endor table, and that's the Hoth table, and they're all gorgeous. And it's because they accommodate a variety of terrain types, and they're all built within this very simple set of terrain rules, where adding a new piece of terrain doesn't make you question, oh, how does it fit this set of terrain rules? Oh, is this a ruin, or is this a debris, or how do we handle this? And the fact that you can just throw on terrain and say that's a heavy piece of terrain, and oh, that's a light piece of terrain, and it just works, it's nice, because when you show up to the table, you don't have to do much more than just define, this is heavy, this is light, boom, let's start deploying our guys, and you get to playing.
And
And
as a Timmy slash Johnny player, I love it because you can get to a table and you go, oh my gosh, this is the set of Andor, and I love that show. Like, that's so cool, and you don't have to get bogged down in the rules too much. But then, like, so I brought up like weird situations that can come up because you have more complex rules, because you have so many different terrain types. And this is an example that they bring up in the Goonhammer article about if you have large models that are not wholly within ruins, and it leads to this really weird situation where, in this instance, the Plague Burst crawler does not cannot draw a line of sight to the hammerhead because it's not wholly within the ruin. Now, that may be because of a definition error when people came to the table and they say, oh yeah, this is a ruin, and if you make it a debris, then the Plague Burst crawler can target the hammerhead. But it's just like, your rules shouldn't be that way. Like, it doesn't make sense in the physical world that, like, this Plague Burst crawler can definitely see the hammerhead, you should be able to shoot it.
right.
I don't like games where the way that you set up the table or the rules of the terrain dictate the game so strongly that it can just like ruin your experience.
Yeah, for sure. And games like Kill Team have definitely done that in our experience. It seems like the terrain has had too much to do with the outcome of the game. But the the fact that you can't, and maybe this is something that, as a experienced player, you'll be like, oh, once you define the terrain, I shouldn't put myself in this situation. And and that comes with experience, which is understandable. But the fact that I can do that feels like a gotcha, and I am not a huge fan of gotchas in any game. and it feels really bad as a new player if I'm playing a game with someone and I put my guy there because I'm like, yeah, I want my plague burst crawler to go up right behind this debris, and he's gonna hold this lane or whatever. And then I go to shoot, and you're like, oh, you can't draw a line of sight because he's on this template. And I'm like, what? My model's over the debris, and he should be able to see him. But you're like, no, the rules say, and it just feels so bad. It feels unnecessary to us as new players.
Mm-hmm. And then it leads into a situation where you gotta like rules guide your opponent and be like, don't move them there. Like you're gonna screw yourself over, and it's just like it makes it less fun. And you don't want to be that player that just like lets them move there and be like, hey, you can't shoot me now.
And take advantage of them. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so let's move back into what we like about 10th edition. So while we're talking about the terrain rules did get simpler, maybe not as simple as we would have liked, but one change that we did like was what we would call simplified but not simple rules. Do you want to elaborate on that, Brooke, for us?
Yeah, so one of the things that was very complicated about ninth edition, and we didn't have a ton of core knowledge of ninth edition, but this is one of the things that we did see in ninth edition is the universal core rules that or keywords that exist in the game. They all had a different name in every faction. And if I had a rule that said I have the strong wolf hide and it gives me a 4+ invuln, I would say, oh, I have a strong wolf hide. And Drew, as the orc player, goes, I have no idea what that means. And I'm like, oh, I have a 4+ invuln. He goes, oh, yeah, 4+ invuln. And as opposed to just calling it a 4+ invuln or whatever, they would complicate it by giving all these different rules a different name. And it just overcomplicated things. And the simplified version of the rules where they streamline it to make everything kind of branch off of this core set of concepts, and everything shares these core concepts. Basically, it makes it a lot simpler for me as somebody who is playing a random person at a table of one of 29 different factions. I don't have to learn 29 different factions just to be able to play the game and understand what's happening. They can say, "Oh, I'm doing this. It has this keyword. It does this thing," and I'll be like, "Oh, I know those. I know what that's doing. Mm-hmm. I know exactly what that's doing because I've learned my rules." And it doesn't require me to learn a whole dictionary worth of rules just to play a game with a random opponent.
And one positive aspect of the universal rules from my perspective is just like you can explain to me the effect of one of your units, and like I can be like, that's so cool, like that's so good. Or with we have this new Crute release currently as we're speaking, and you are getting previews of some of the new units, and you can actually appreciate those units without like having the Tau Codex memorized and knowing what each of their keywords means. We're all using the same words when we're describing what our units do, and it just gives you like an appreciation. My jaw might drop when you tell me like Ragnar does that to me, like holy crap, he's so good. Like the fact that you can tell me that and I appreciate it instead of telling me a bunch of like Space Wolf jargon, and then I'm like, huh? And then you tell me what it does, and I'm like, oh, that sucks. It's just like you tell me what he does, and it's like, wow, that's he's a baller. Like he's gonna screw me up. Like it's so much cooler that everybody understands each other on a core rules level, because I don't think lore needs to be in the rules. Like we have enough lore as it is. Let's keep the rules as simple as possible.
Right.
All right, so let's go ahead and move into our last point, which I think might be the most important to both of us, which is just kind of how much simpler the army list building requirements are, and it just makes it so much easier for theory crafting. So I'm going to get a graphic up. So Brooke, do you want to go ahead and take this one and start explaining our thoughts on this?
Yeah. So one of the things that we find very important in a game that we want to play, a game that we enjoy, is the list building and theory crafting side of it. The fact that you can go and build lists far more simply, it incentivizes you to experiment with your list building. And that's something that we really enjoyed from Legion. When we played Legion very seriously, um, we would share lists back and forth and be like, "Oh, how about check out this Empire list that I'm building, or check out this Shadow Collective. What do you think about this?" And the fact that we would do that, it kept us invested in talking about the game outside of hobbying and playing the game, and it makes it a lot more engaging as a player, and it tickles the like Spike side of my brain and the Johnny side of my brain, where I want to optimize my list and I want to do something cool. Like I want to play with that cool piece that I painted up, and having the ability to theory craft and list build easier without having to go into a bunch of different complicated pairings of detachments and how many detachments you get and what's required between those detachments. It gets so complicated, um, at least in our, I guess, experience of, or our opinion of previous editions. It it is so much simpler in this edition. It makes it way more straightforward. We don't have to worry about as many rules, and we don't have to worry about um, trying to piece together lists that we find online and try to figure out exactly how those lists are built, because it's a lot more straightforward. And I think Drew
Yeah.
has something about how the lists are built and what's required, and
Mm-hmm.
just this list is so much simpler than what we're used to.
Yeah, and we are starting in 10th edition, but it it's not it's not like we haven't been interested in previous editions, and one of the things that's really turned us off on previous editions was how complicated it was to build a list, because it really makes it hard to get started with the game. You can't just find a list that appeals to you and then start it. You just like you read through the list and it might not make sense to you without knowing the rules, but you can read a list in 10th edition and kind of have a pretty good idea of what you need to do to get into this game. And that's because the list building requirements are so streamlined. So this is just like the unit requirements, but there's not much more than this when it comes to list building. So when you build a list, I can just rattle off the list requirements to you now. That's how simple they are. I need to pick an army size, so how many points we're going to play with. Then I'm going to pick a detachment that I'm going to play with, a faction and a detachment. And then these are my unit requirements. I need at least one character unit who's going to be my warlord. And then I can only have a max of one of each epic hero, up to three of the same data sheet for all my other units, so the rule of three. And then up to six of the same battle line or dedicated transport units, which that's it. That's all you need to know to build a list in Warhammer 40k, which to me is just like awesome, because I don't have to think of like, and this is sort of a problem in Star Wars Legion. I'm not getting nickel and dimed on like each individual accessory that I want to include with my units. I don't have to think like, oh, I want to take this gun instead of this gun, and it costs 10 points for this one, 5 points for this one. And like my my decisions and my list building are at a unit level, so the actual composition of my army instead of the accessories that my units are carrying. And when you're playing an army game, like a game that is made up of large units in an army, like that's where the decisions to me should lie, instead of the accessories that my battle line units are carrying with them.
Right. And I feel like the nice thing about making the decisions at an army level is if I want to include a unit and I built it out as some sort of way to build out that unit, I'm not going to be punished because I hobbied it a certain way. Because I decided to include a plasma pistol on my sergeant as opposed to a bolt pistol. Or I didn't include I wanted to build the power sword, but that power sword is an extra X points as opposed to my chain sword. And the fact that I'm not punished on the hobby side because I like the look of a certain weapon or way I want to build them is really nice as a new player, because when I'm going to buy a new unit, I don't have to worry about looking up the rules and being like, okay, all right, what's good right now? Like, how should I build this? I
Mm-hmm.
can instead think about what I want to build and how I want the unit to behave, and it's going to fit within the list building as it is in 10th edition, because if I build it with option A or option B, they're the same points. And I don't have to worry about that extra 20 points or whatever it would be if I chose that certain type of weapon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I better not take shoes with my infantry guys. They're just gonna have to get trench foot because I want to take this cool gun with my other unit. Like, that's stupid.
Yeah. My
that's a,
troopers aren't allowed to wear shoes because my sergeant decided to wear a cool hat.
yeah, that's an extreme example, but it's just that's kind of to me it's just silly to like be worrying about what everybody's carrying and just like you and that's where kind of the detachment comes into play. And again, like Warhammer 10th edition is pretty new, and we don't have all the detachments yet. And I think we can see where they're going with it at this point. But the hope is that we're going to have enough detachments to cater to whatever your play style is. So, I'm building a unit of knobs. If I'm building mine with power claws because that's what I want to build, and it does happen to be like the better meta with knobs or whatever. But I'm building like speed Y. I want them to like get in a vehicle, get in your face, and then just like bash you. But if I wanted to be more of a DACA army and build them with combi weapons, hopefully there's going to be a detachment once the Orc Codex comes out that will cater to that play style. And that fits into exactly what you were saying, Brooke, that you will not be stuck in that analysis paralysis of like, how am I going to build my army? You can build it however you want because it's going to cost the same amount, and they're going to balance the game so that that unit is usable however you want to play it.
And there might be a negative, and there probably is a negative here, where there might be a quote unquote best way to run a unit. Like, oh, if I run my eliminators, the best way to run the eliminators is with the las fusel because they're more efficient at taking out armor, and they do just enough to infantry as well to be the best version of eliminators. But I can build them as bolt carbine or bolt snipers or whatever the heck they're called. I can build them as that and not be punished because I didn't choose the las fusels, or vice versa. If the las fusels are better, it's not like in previous editions. If I chose I want to go las fusels, but that's an extra 20 points, I'm not punished because I decided to go las fusels because I think they look cool, and then I have to try to find 20 points in my list to try to pull those shoes off of the infantry or whatever. Like, I don't have to worry about that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this kind of also goes into another point about this. Is it felt like, and maybe this is a bad read of how GW would handle balance in the previous editions, but it almost felt like GW was making hobby decisions for you by pointing the loadout options. If they make a certain loadout a certain amount of points, you're probably not going to want to build that option because it costs that many points. And they're making decisions for you at a hobby level that they shouldn't be making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm sure there's I know there's other negatives that we're not bringing up about the new list building mechanisms, as far as like I know like a lot of people like to build out their own like captains or whatever. You could customize your own unit, and you can't really do that anymore. But I don't know. That's not the granular level that we care about coming from other games. So this is just something that appeals to us. So like if you are screaming at us right now, leave a comment and just tell us like what you liked about the old list building, because we would love to hear your thoughts on what you liked about previous edition list buildings, and maybe you'll open our eyes to like some of the benefits there. So but these are just some of the things we've liked so far.
And if you disagree with us on us not liking the terrain rules, comment. Tell us why the terrain rules are great, and it might actually open our eyes to maybe appreciating them a little bit more.
And like if there's other things about 10th edition that you don't like, just leave a comment. We'd like to talk to you. Or if there's things you do like that we didn't bring up, leave a comment. Let everybody know like what you like about the game so far, and if you have experience playing it, let us know what we like, or gotchas that we haven't thought about, because we're planning on playing our first game next week at Adepticon. We're going to be traveling to Chicago in a week from now, and yeah, just we would love to engage with our community.
Yeah, we would love to hear from you. We will try to make regular posts on the community page. If you want to interact with us there or interact with us in the comment section below, we would love to hear from you. We are, again, we're new. We want to learn, and we want to also maybe get an appreciation for the people who've been around the game for a lot longer than us, and maybe have a better understanding of why things are the way they are, and maybe understand why some people don't like the way things are going. But we would love to hear from you either way. And if you could comment below, leave us a like, it would really help us get our name out there and start growing this community.
And if anything, we hope we brought you all a unique perspective, because I know one of the things with 10th edition that people have been saying is that they're making this game for people who aren't even playing the game, and we kind of fall into that a little bit right now because we haven't even played the game yet, and we're building,
we are those people.
Yeah, we're building our armies now to play the game. So like this game, or this edition, you're saying it's targeted towards players like us. This is what we see in it and why we like it. And you're probably, I know people have been mad about that, and it's right for people to keep their game, because there were things that made the game great before we even came to it, and that's what we want to hear from you guys, like what made it great before we got here, because we want to be able to appreciate those things too. But these are our perspectives as new players, and why we've decided to actually take that step of playing Warhammer 40k finally in 10th edition. So that's pretty much all we have for you guys today. That's all of the points we had, and I think probably in a week from now we'll be releasing maybe an update from Adepticon. We're going to be going to, I know GW is going to be having a little teaser for some of their upcoming releases at Adepticon, and we did get a ticket to go to that, so maybe we'll release some of that if there's anything cool. Also
talk about some previews.
Yes, and then we've talked about in our first video, we talked about some of the hobbying we've been doing. I think we'll probably do a video here soon with like a little hobby update to show you the progress of our armies so far. So that's pretty much all we have for you guys this week, and we hope you've enjoyed the episode. Leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe if you want to follow us and not miss any updates of any new additions. So that's all we have for you guys this week. It's been nice talking to you all, and we hope you guys tune in next week.